A routine traffic stop on a quiet evening became the spark for an unexpected and explosive confrontation. It all started when a police officer, driven by arrogance and assumptions, stopped a sleek black car during a roadside check. Behind the wheel sat a woman with an air of calm confidence, but her composed demeanor seemed to provoke something in the officer. He approached with a swagger that carried more authority than respect, his voice sharp and condescending. "Step out of the car," he demanded, his tone laced with impatience. The woman raised an eyebrow, unfastened her seatbelt, and stepped out slowly, meeting his gaze without flinching. She offered her license and ID with steady hands, but he didn't bother to look at them. Instead, his eyes scanned her attire, casual but sharp, and his smirk deepened. He dismissed her identity without a second glance, making an assumption that would cost him dearly. "Where'd you steal this car?" he sneered, ignoring her attempts to speak. "Don't play games with me." "I'm not playing games," she replied firmly, her voice measured but resolute. "This is my car, and you need to check the documents if you doubt it." But her calm demeanor only seemed to stoke his anger. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, pulling her closer in an effort to assert dominance. The woman yanked her arm back, her composure breaking momentarily as she snapped, "Let go of me. I am not resisting, and I have every right to be here." The officer's face flushed with anger. He didn't see a citizen trying to assert her rights, he saw defiance, and it infuriated him. A crowd began to gather, sensing the tension escalating. The officer leaned in, his voice lowering to a growl that only she could hear. "People like you think they can get away with anything. Not on my watch." Then, to the shock of everyone watching, he raised a fist as if to strike her. Gasps rippled through the small crowd, but before his punch could land, the woman's hand shot up, deflecting the blow with precision. In one swift motion, she took a step back, her commanding presence suddenly impossible to ignore. The officer froze, his hand still midair. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of bewilderment and, for the first time, fear. She locked eyes with him, her voice steady but cutting. "Do you even know who I am?" Silence fell over the scene. The bystanders, the officer, even the cars passing by seemed to hold their breath. He faltered, his arrogance cracking under the weight of her question. "You don't have any right to," he began, but his words stumbled as she reached into her jacket and pulled out an official badge. The symbol of her authority glinted under the streetlight, its presence like a thunderclap. "I'm your boss." The officer's face went pale. The weight of his mistake hit him like a freight train, but the storm wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a level that made every word cut deeper. "You had one job, to serve and protect. Instead, you harass and intimidate. This ends now." The crowd murmured in shock, realizing that this wasn't just another roadside stop gone wrong. The tension in the air crackled as the officer's superiors arrived, summoned by the very badge he had ignored. The tables turned so quickly it was dizzying. What happens next is a story of consequences, justice, and unexpected twists that will leave you speechless. What does she do with the power now in her hands? How does the officer's past come back to haunt him? And, most importantly, what impact will this moment have on everyone who witnessed it? You'll want to stay until the end, because what happens next will change everything. Before we dive into the story, we want to take a moment to say this: Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism and any form of discrimination. To all our Black viewers watching, your voice matters, your experiences matter, and your worth is undeniable. We are here to tell stories that confront injustice and celebrate resilience. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these powerful narratives. Now, sit back and enjoy a story that will inspire, provoke, and surprise you. Let's begin. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings in Atlanta when the streets hummed with the rhythm of daily life. The sun cast a golden glow over the bustling avenues, and the chatter of people mixed with the occasional honking of cars. Among the chaos, Regina Carter emerged from her townhouse, her neatly pressed navy suit reflecting the authority she carried. Regina wasn't just any public servant, she was the newly appointed chief of police, a position she had fought for tirelessly. At 38, she was the youngest person, and the first black woman, to ever hold the title in the city. Her journey to the top wasn't just about breaking glass ceilings, it was about demolishing the entire structure of systemic racism that had stood in her way. She had grown up in the heart of the city, in a neighborhood often ignored by the authorities she now led. Her childhood was marked by resilience and a fierce sense of justice instilled by her mother, who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Regina's earliest memories were of sitting at the kitchen table, watching her mother write letters to city officials about better policing in their area. Those letters rarely received responses, but they sparked a fire in Regina. She wanted to change the system from within. After earning her law degree, Regina worked her way up through the police ranks. She was known for her sharp mind and her refusal to compromise on integrity, even when it made her unpopular. Her promotion to chief of police was both a triumph and a challenge. She knew the weight of her position carried expectations that few others in her field would ever face. She was a symbol of progress in a department riddled with outdated practices, and she wasn't afraid to shake things up. Across town, Officer Greg Walters was finishing his coffee in the precinct break room. At 45, he was a veteran of the force, but not one known for his stellar record. Greg had built a reputation for being quick to judge and even quicker to anger, especially when dealing with minorities. To his colleagues, he was a relic of the past, a cop who hadn't evolved with the times. Greg saw himself differently. He believed in old-school policing, a euphemism he used to justify his prejudices and aggressive behavior. Greg's personal life mirrored his professional one, messy and full of unresolved tension. Divorced and estranged from his 2 teenage kids, he poured all his frustrations into his work. He saw the department's recent changes as a personal attack, especially the appointment of Regina Carter. He resented her for reasons he'd never say out loud but which festered beneath the surface: her age, her race, and, most of all, her authority. Their worlds were destined to collide, and the circumstances that brought them together would test everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and accountability. On the day of the incident, Regina decided to conduct a surprise inspection of one of the department's most problematic units. She wanted to understand the root of the complaints she'd received about certain officers. Dressed in plain clothes and driving her personal car, she planned to observe without drawing attention to herself. Her polished exterior and confident demeanor remained intact, but underneath, she felt the familiar tension of walking into hostile territory. Greg, meanwhile, had been assigned to a routine traffic checkpoint. He was already in a foul mood, having been reprimanded earlier that week for an outburst during a sensitivity training session. As cars rolled through, Greg scrutinized each driver with the intensity of someone looking for a fight. When Regina's sleek black sedan approached, something about it set him off. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't immediately look flustered, like so many others did under his glare. Or maybe it was her calm expression that seemed to challenge his authority without a single word. "Pull over," Greg barked, waving her to the side. He didn't bother with pleasantries as he approached her car, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, a habit he didn't reserve for everyone. Regina rolled down the window and handed over her license and registration without a word. Greg didn't even glance at the documents. Instead, his eyes roved over her car and then back to her face. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone sharp. Regina hesitated for a moment, surprised by his aggressiveness. But she complied, stepping out and standing tall. The disparity in their body language was striking: Greg, tense and confrontational, versus Regina, calm and steady. She attempted to explain that she was on official business, but Greg cut her off before she could finish. "Official business?" he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't look official to me." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they came from someone who should have known better. Regina remained composed, but the injustice of the moment was palpable. Greg leaned closer, invading her personal space, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "People like you think you're above the law." Regina's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The humiliation was simmering just beneath the surface, but she knew this wasn't the time to unleash it. She tried once more to de-escalate the situation, suggesting he check her ID more closely. Greg snatched the badge she discreetly held out, glancing at it briefly before tossing it back. "I don't care who you say you are. Around here, you follow my rules." The tension was electric, drawing the attention of passers-by. A small crowd began to gather at a distance, their faces reflecting curiosity and concern. Regina could feel their eyes on her, but her focus remained on Greg, who was now visibly enjoying the power he thought he held. "Are you going to arrest me?" Regina asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The question seemed to catch Greg off guard, and for a split second, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a smug grin. "I'll do whatever I damn well please," he replied, his hand moving slightly toward his baton. Regina held her ground, but the humiliation of the encounter was undeniable. She had spent her entire career fighting for a seat at the table, only to be treated as if she didn't belong. The crowd murmured, their unease growing. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Who was she? Why wasn't she backing down? And what would happen next? As the confrontation continued, neither of them knew that this moment would set off a chain of events that neither could control. The simmering tensions would explode in ways that would leave everyone reeling and force Greg to confront the consequences of his actions in a way he never expected. The station buzzed with the usual mid-morning energy as Regina sat in her office, her eyes scanning reports and emails. She had expected the previous day's incident to weigh on her, but the simmering frustration wouldn't dissipate. Greg's sneering face, his dismissive tone, the crowd of onlookers, all of it replayed in her mind like a tape stuck on loop. She took a deep breath, centering herself. This wasn't her first encounter with blatant disrespect, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just an insult to her, it was an affront to everything she'd worked so hard to change. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Sergeant Daniels, her most trusted advisor, stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes betraying concern. "We need to talk," Daniels said, closing the door behind him. Regina gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, his hands clasped in front of him. "I heard about what happened at the checkpoint yesterday." Regina leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowing. "Let me guess, it's already circulating around the department." Daniels nodded. "There's chatter. Some of the officers are uneasy about how you handled it." Regina frowned. "Uneasy? Because I didn't let him walk all over me?" "It's not that simple," Daniels said carefully. "You know how things are here. There's a faction that doesn't think you should be in this position. They're looking for any excuse to undermine you." "Good," Regina said firmly, sitting upright. "Let them look. I don't need their approval to do my job." Daniels hesitated. "What's your next move?" Regina considered his question. She knew Greg wouldn't come forward to admit his behavior, and the crowd at the scene hadn't included anyone willing to step in. But she also knew this wasn't just about one incident, it was about setting a precedent. "I'm not letting this slide," she said finally. "He broke protocol. He tried to use intimidation instead of reason. That has to be addressed." Daniels sighed. "Then be prepared for backlash. He has allies. They'll make this personal." Regina's jaw tightened. "It already is personal." Meanwhile, across town, Greg was sitting at a bar with two other officers, his hand wrapped around a glass of whiskey. His posture was slouched, but his voice was animated as he recounted the previous day's events. "She thinks she can just waltz in here and take over," Greg said, his tone dripping with contempt. "Like she's some kind of savior. One of the officers, a younger man named Carson, shifted uncomfortably. I mean, she is the chief, Greg. Maybe you should have handled it differently. Greg shot him a glare. Handled it differently? She disrespected me. Carson looked skeptical but didn't push further. The third officer, an older man named Davis, clapped Greg on the shoulder. Don't worry about it, man. She's not gonna last. They'll chew her up and spit her out. Just keep your head down. But Greg wasn't interested in keeping his head down. His pride was wounded, and he was determined to prove a point. He wasn't ready to admit it, but a part of him was starting to regret how far he had pushed things. Yet instead of owning up to his actions, he doubled down on his narrative, framing himself as the victim of an overreach. Back at the station, Regina called a meeting with her executive team. As they gathered in the conference room, the air was thick with tension. She could see the unease on some of their faces, especially from those who had been part of the old guard before her arrival. I'm sure you've all heard about what happened yesterday, Regina began, her tone measured. Let me make one thing clear, this department will not tolerate harassment or abuse of power, from anyone. There were murmurs of agreement, though some officers avoided her gaze. We are supposed to serve and protect, she continued, her voice gaining strength. What happened yesterday was a failure of those principles. And I won't stand by and let it happen again. One officer, Captain Harris, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Chief, this department has always had its way of doing things. Sometimes situations escalate. It's not always black and white. Regina fixed him with a steady stare. It is when an officer raises his hand to strike an unarmed civilian. That's not an escalation, that's abuse. Harris fell silent, though his jaw tightened in defiance. After the meeting, Regina returned to her office, feeling both resolute and weary. She knew change wouldn't come easily, but she hadn't anticipated just how entrenched the resistance would be. Later that evening, as Regina drove home, she noticed a car tailing her. Her instincts kicked in, and she took a few sharp turns to confirm her suspicion. The car stayed with her. Her grip tightened on the wheel as adrenaline coursed through her. Was it a coincidence, or something more sinister? She pulled into a well-lit gas station, parking directly under a security camera. The other car hesitated before driving past, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Regina noted the license plate and made a mental note to run it through the system in the morning. The following day, tensions within the department reached a boiling point. An anonymous email circulated among the officers, accusing Regina of overstepping her authority and questioning her qualifications. The email was filled with thinly veiled racist undertones, and while it didn't name Greg directly, it was clear who the sender was trying to protect. Regina read the email twice, her anger building with each line. She printed it out and brought it straight to Daniels. This has gone too far, she said, slamming the paper on his desk. Find out who sent this. Daniels nodded grimly. Already on it. But Chief, this is dangerous. They're not just trying to undermine you, they're trying to make you leave. Then they're going to be disappointed, Regina said. I'm not going anywhere. As she walked back to her office, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a video link sent by an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before clicking on it. The video showed the checkpoint from 2 days ago, captured by a bystander. It clearly showed Greg's aggressive behavior and his attempt to strike her. Her pulse quickened. This was the proof she needed to hold him accountable. But as the video ended, another message appeared on her screen: this won't end well for you if you keep pushing. Regina stared at the message, her mind racing. The stakes were higher than she'd realized, and she knew she was up against more than just one man's ego. This was systemic. And the fight was only just beginning. Regina sat in her office, her fingers drumming against the desk as she stared at the video on her phone for the 100th time. Each frame was a damning indictment of Greg's behavior and, by extension, the culture that allowed it to fester. She'd forwarded it to Internal Affairs earlier that morning, along with a formal request for an expedited investigation. The anonymous threat still lingered in her mind, but fear wasn't an option. Not now. A knock at the door broke her focus. Daniels stepped in, closing the door behind him. His expression was serious, bordering on grim. "We've identified the sender of that email," he said, placing a folder on her desk. It was Greg. Regina leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Not surprising." "There's more," Daniels continued. "He's been talking to some of the officers, trying to rally support. He's saying you're targeting him unfairly, that this is some kind of personal vendetta." Regina's jaw tightened. "Does he really think that will work?" Daniels shrugged. "It's working with some of them. You've seen the division in this department. People like Greg don't just go quietly. They make noise, and they drag people down with them." "Well," Regina said, her voice firm, "he's about to find out how wrong he is." As Daniels left, Regina made her decision. She picked up her phone and called a department-wide meeting for the afternoon. If Greg wanted to play games, he'd have to do it in the open. Hours later, the conference room was filled with officers. The air buzzed with tension, and Regina could feel the weight of every gaze on her. Greg stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of defiance. Daniels stood near her, a quiet but steady presence of support. "Thank you all for coming," Regina began, her voice steady and clear. "I wanted to address the incident from 2 days ago and the subsequent fallout." Her eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Greg. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of wary suspicion. "Some of you may have seen the video," she continued, pulling up the footage on a large screen. The room fell silent as the video played, each frame a stark reminder of Greg's actions. By the time it ended, the tension in the room was palpable. "This is not how we serve the community," Regina said, her voice rising slightly. "This is not how we conduct ourselves as officers of the law. And this is not how we treat each other." Greg shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "There's no room in this department for abuse of power," Regina continued. "And there's no room for those who think they're above accountability." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she turned to Greg directly. "Officer Walters, do you have anything to say?" Greg's eyes flickered around the room, searching for support. A few officers avoided his gaze, while others looked at him expectantly. He cleared his throat and stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You're making this into something it's not. That video doesn't show the whole story." Regina raised an eyebrow. "Then please, enlighten us." Greg hesitated, the weight of the room pressing down on him. I was doing my job. She was acting suspicious. I had to make sure she wasn't a threat." "And you thought raising your hand to strike an unarmed woman was part of your job?" Regina's tone was sharp, cutting through his excuses. Greg's face flushed. "I didn't hit anyone. You blocked it before I could." "That doesn't make it any better," Regina shot back. "The intent was there. The abuse of power was there. And it's not the first time, is it?" The room murmured as Regina held up a folder filled with complaints against Greg. "These are just some of the reports filed against you over the years. Most of them were dismissed or buried. But not this time." Greg's smirk returned, though it was more desperate than confident. "You think you can take me down? I've been here longer than you. I know how this department works." "And that's exactly why we're here," Regina said, stepping closer. "Because the way this department works is broken. People like you have been allowed to thrive in a system that protects the wrong kind of officers. But not anymore." Greg's eyes narrowed. "You think you're a hero? You think anyone here actually respects you?" "I don't need your respect," Regina replied calmly. I need this department to be better. And if that means taking you down, so be it. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Greg took a step forward, his fists clenched. But before he could say anything, Daniels spoke up. That's enough, Walters. You've done enough damage. Greg turned, glaring at Daniels. Of course you'd side with her. You're just as much a part of this as she is. I am, Daniels said firmly. Because it's time we held ourselves accountable. And if you can't see that, you don't belong here. Greg's defiance faltered as more officers nodded in agreement. The tide was turning, and he knew it. Regina stepped back, letting the moment settle. Officer Walters, she said finally, her voice steady. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. Turn in your badge and your weapon. Greg hesitated, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. Slowly, he removed his badge and placed it on the table, his hand trembling slightly. The room watched in silence as he walked out, his footsteps echoing in the tense air. Regina took a deep breath, her composure unshaken. She turned back to the officers. This isn't just about one person, she said. It's about all of us. We have a responsibility to this community and to each other. If we can't live up to that, then we don't deserve these badges. The room was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, the officers began to nod. The cracks in the old system were showing, and Regina knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. As the meeting ended, Daniels approached her. You did the right thing, he said quietly. Regina nodded, her gaze steady. It's not over yet. But we're getting there. Outside the precinct, Greg stood by his car, his mind racing. He wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. Greg sat in his car outside the precinct, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His badge and gun were gone, symbols of the authority he had clung to for decades. His mind reeled with anger, humiliation, and a gnawing fear he couldn't shake. He had built his entire identity around being a cop, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. She thinks she can do this to me, he muttered, his voice low and venomous. She doesn't know who she's messing with. Across the city, Regina returned to her office, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. The adrenaline of the confrontation had worn off, leaving her with the familiar ache of fighting battles that shouldn't have to be fought. She sank into her chair, rubbing her temples, but before she could gather her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a message. The sender was anonymous, but the message was clear: you've made a lot of enemies. Watch your back. Regina stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She had anticipated pushback, but the direct threat hit harder than she expected. She forwarded the message to Daniels, adding a note: we need to trace this. Urgent. A knock at the door pulled her attention. Daniels entered, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. I just got your message, he said, holding up his phone. This is serious. Regina nodded. They're desperate. That makes them dangerous. Daniels hesitated before sitting across from her. Look, Chief, I've got your back. But you need to be careful. People like Greg don't go down quietly. I know, Regina replied, her voice steady. But if we let this kind of behavior slide, we might as well hand them the keys to the department. Daniels leaned forward, his tone urgent. You've already done more than most people in your position ever would. You've called out the rot in this department and put it on notice. But if you push too hard, too fast, you could lose everything. Regina met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. Then I lose everything. But at least I'll lose it fighting for what's right. As Daniels left, Regina leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew Greg wouldn't go quietly. He was too proud, too entrenched in his toxic worldview to accept accountability. The question wasn't whether he'd retaliate, it was how. Meanwhile, Greg sat in his darkened apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He scrolled through his phone, reading comments on a leaked article about his suspension. The story had spread quickly, and the responses were brutal. Good riddance. People like him shouldn't be cops. He's exactly what's wrong with law enforcement. Finally, someone's holding these guys accountable. Each comment felt like a punch to the gut, but it was the messages from his few remaining allies that truly stoked his anger. They encouraged him to fight back, to expose Regina as the real problem. One message, in particular, caught his eye. "Meet me tonight. I have something that can help you." The sender was anonymous, but the implication was clear. Greg smirked, downing the rest of his drink. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. That evening, Regina was at home, going over files from the day's meeting. Her apartment was modest but warm, filled with books and photos of her family. The noise of the city hummed in the background, a constant reminder of the world she was fighting to protect. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Daniels. "Chief," he said, his voice urgent. "We traced the message you got earlier. It came from Greg's phone." Regina's stomach tightened. "You're sure?" "Positive. He's not working alone, though. We intercepted some chatter from his old circle. They're planning something, but we don't know what yet." Regina's grip on the phone tightened. "Then we need to move fast. If he's desperate, he's dangerous." Across town, Greg met with a group of men in an abandoned warehouse. They were former officers and fringe agitators, all of whom had grievances against the department's recent reforms. Greg stood at the center, his voice full of defiance. "They think they can ruin me," he said, pacing. "They think they can replace us with people like her. But they're wrong. This isn't just about me, it's about everything we've worked for." One of the men, a burly ex-cop named Mitchell, stepped forward. "So what's the plan? You gonna take this to the media?" Greg smirked. "Something like that. I've got dirt on her, enough to turn this whole thing upside down." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "And if that doesn't work?" Greg's expression darkened. "Then we make sure she can't keep this job." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The next day, Regina arrived at the precinct to find a tense atmosphere. Officers whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward her as she walked past. Daniels met her at the door, his expression grim. "They leaked the video," he said. Regina frowned. "The footage from the checkpoint?" Daniels nodded. "But they edited it to make it look like you provoked him. It's already all over social media." Regina felt a flash of anger but quickly pushed it down. "We have the original footage. We can prove it's fake." "True," Daniels said. "But the damage is already done. People are questioning your leadership." Regina took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then we respond. We release the full video and let the truth speak for itself." As the day unfolded, the department held a press conference, with Regina standing firmly at the podium. She presented the unedited footage, dismantling Greg's narrative piece by piece. The reporters pressed her with questions, some veiled with skepticism, others outright hostile. "Chief Carter," one reporter asked, "do you think your actions are dividing the department?" Regina met the question head-on. "No. What divides a department is a refusal to hold people accountable. What divides a department is tolerating abuse and calling it tradition. I'm here to change that, and I won't apologize for it." The crowd murmured, the tension palpable. As the press conference ended, Regina felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. But she also felt something else, resolve. Greg's attempts to undermine her had only strengthened her commitment to the fight ahead. That evening, as Regina reviewed the day's events, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've won this round. But it's not over." Regina stared at the message, her mind racing. She didn't know what Greg's next move would be, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready. The precinct was unusually quiet the next morning, the kind of silence that carried the weight of unresolved tension. Regina arrived early, her steps purposeful, her mind racing through the events of the past days. The press conference had quelled some of the immediate backlash, but she knew the battle was far from over. The department was still divided, and Greg's allies weren't going to back down easily. Daniels was already waiting for her in her office, his face drawn and serious. He held a stack of papers in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, setting both down as she entered. "Good morning," he said, though his tone lacked the usual warmth. "Morning," Regina replied, removing her coat. "What's the latest?" Daniels handed her the papers. "Internal Affairs is moving forward with the investigation, but we've got another problem. Rumors are spreading about the department's leadership, specifically about you." Regina raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, they're trying to paint me as a tyrant." "Something like that," Daniels said. "They're saying you're targeting Greg unfairly, that this is part of some bigger agenda." Regina exhaled sharply. "Of course they are. People like Greg can't admit when they're wrong, so they twist the narrative to make themselves the victim." Daniels hesitated before speaking again. "There's more. We intercepted a meeting Greg had with some of his old contacts. He's trying to dig up dirt on you, anything he can use to discredit you further." Regina leaned back in her chair, her mind working quickly. "Let him try. I've lived my life with integrity. There's nothing for him to find." Daniels hesitated. "Maybe not. But perception is often more powerful than truth." The words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Regina nodded slowly, acknowledging the reality of the situation. She had faced smear campaigns before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her reputation, it was about the future of the department and the trust of the community. Later that day, Regina met with a group of community leaders who had requested a meeting to discuss the ongoing tensions. The room was filled with a mix of concerned citizens, activists, and local officials, all of whom had a vested interest in the department's actions. "We're here because we want to see real change," said Marcus Johnson, a prominent community organizer. "What happened with Officer Walters isn't just about one man, it's about a culture that's been allowed to thrive for too long." Regina nodded, her expression serious. "I agree. That's why we're taking these steps, even though they're uncomfortable. Change doesn't come without resistance." Another leader, a woman named Linda Ramirez, leaned forward. "But how do we know this isn't just a surface-level fix? How do we know you're committed to making this more than just a public relations campaign?" Regina met her gaze directly. "Because I've lived through it. I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of injustice, and I won't stop until this department reflects the values it's supposed to uphold." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, Marcus nodded. "We'll hold you to that, Chief Carter." As the meeting wrapped up, Regina felt a renewed sense of purpose. The community was watching closely, and she couldn't afford to let them down. But the challenges ahead were formidable, and Greg was still a wild card. That evening, Regina received a call from one of her allies in internal affairs. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "Chief, we've uncovered something you need to see. It's about Greg." "What is it?" Regina asked, her heart skipping a beat. "We've found evidence linking him to several questionable incidents over the years. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling, even allegations of corruption. It's a pattern." Regina's grip on the phone tightened. Why wasn't this addressed before? Most of the complaints were buried or dismissed by his superiors at the time, the voice replied. But now that we've connected the dots, it paints a clear picture. Regina felt a surge of both relief and anger. This was the leverage she needed to dismantle Greg's support, but it was infuriating that it had taken so long to come to light. The next day, she called another meeting with her executive team, presenting the evidence against Greg in meticulous detail. The room was tense, but as the facts piled up, even his staunchest allies began to waver. Captain Harris, who had been one of Greg's vocal supporters, finally spoke up. "This doesn't look good," he admitted, his voice subdued. "If this all checks out, there's no defending him." "It does check out," Regina said firmly. "And it's time we stopped protecting people like him. If we're serious about reform, we have to start here." The meeting ended with a resolution to proceed with disciplinary action against Greg, but Regina knew the fallout would be significant. His suspension was one thing, outright termination was another. It would send a message, but it would also provoke backlash from those who still clung to the old ways. That evening, as Regina sat in her office, her phone buzzed with another text. This time, the sender wasn't anonymous. "You think this is over? It's not. You'll regret this." It was from Greg. Regina stared at the message, her pulse quickening. She forwarded it to Daniels and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Greg was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. But she refused to be intimidated. Across town, Greg sat in his dimly lit apartment, his phone buzzing with messages from his dwindling circle of supporters. He was cornered, and he knew it. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He picked up the phone and dialed a number, his voice low and tense. "We need to meet. Tonight." As the call ended, Greg's mind churned with plans and contingencies. He had lost his badge, his reputation was in tatters, and his allies were abandoning him. But he still had one card left to play, a card that could bring Regina down, or take everything with him. The stage was set for a final showdown, one that would test both Regina's resolve and Greg's capacity for destruction. The consequences of their choices would ripple far beyond the department, reshaping the lives of everyone caught in their crossfire. Regina stood by the window in her office, looking out at the city skyline as the first hints of evening crept over Atlanta. The air was heavy with anticipation, she could feel it pressing down on her chest. The text from Greg lingered in her mind, not because she feared him, but because she knew he was desperate. Desperate people didn't just lash out, they destroyed everything they could on their way down. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. "Chief, we've got something," Daniel said, his voice clipped. "Our team intercepted a meeting Greg had last night. He's planning something big." "What kind of something?" Regina asked, her voice steady despite the tension building inside her. "We're still piecing it together, but it's not just about his career anymore. He's trying to rally others against you, claiming you're using the department for your own agenda." Regina sighed, her patience fraying. "Of course he is. He's spinning lies to cover his tracks." "There's more," Daniel said. "He's been in contact with someone high up, an old connection who still has influence in the department. We think he's trying to use them to escalate things." Regina clenched her jaw. She'd expected resistance, but this was a new level of defiance. "Keep digging," she said. "If he's planning something, I want to know about it before it happens." As she hung up, her assistant knocked and entered the office with a stack of papers. "These just came in from internal affairs," she said. "It's more evidence against Greg." Regina took the papers, flipping through them quickly. The evidence was damning, detailed reports of misconduct, racial profiling, and intimidation tactics spanning years. Each page was a reminder of how deep the rot in the system went. She set the stack down and leaned back in her chair. The fight against Greg wasn't just about him, it was about the system that had protected him, allowed him to thrive, and resisted change at every turn. This wasn't just a battle for justice, it was a battle for the soul of the department. Meanwhile, Greg was in the back room of a small bar, surrounded by a few loyal supporters. The room smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, the atmosphere heavy with resentment and defiance. "This is bullshit," Greg said, slamming his fist on the table. "She's turning the whole department against me. Against us. One of the men, an older officer named Carter, nodded. She's out of control. But what can we do? They've got her protected. Greg smirked, his confidence bolstered by the alcohol in his system. We expose her. Show everyone she's just using this position for her own gain. She doesn't care about the department or the city. Carter hesitated. You sure about this, Greg? If this backfires, it won't, Greg snapped. We've got the numbers, and I've got someone on the inside who's ready to pull the trigger when the time comes. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Greg leaned back, his smirk widening. She thinks she's won. She doesn't know what's coming. The next morning, Regina arrived at the precinct to find Daniels waiting for her, his face lined with worry. We've got a problem, he said. Regina raised an eyebrow. Another one? Daniels handed her a tablet. On the screen was a video of Greg, sitting in what appeared to be a basement or storage room. His tone was measured, but his words were cutting. They want you to believe Chief Carter is a hero, Greg said, staring directly into the camera. But the truth is, she's not here to help this city. She's here to tear it apart. She's using this department to push her own agenda, and anyone who stands in her way gets destroyed. The video cut to clips of edited footage, spliced together to paint Regina as confrontational and unyielding. It was clear Greg was trying to weaponize public opinion against her. This just went live an hour ago, Daniels said. It's already making the rounds on social media. Regina set the tablet down, her expression unreadable. He's trying to smear me into silence. Daniels nodded. And it's working. The comments are a mess, people are questioning everything. Regina took a deep breath. We need to respond. Release a statement, show the full context of those clips. Make it clear this is a desperate attempt to distract from his misconduct. Daniels hesitated. Chief, are you sure? Every time we respond, it just adds fuel to the fire. Regina met his gaze. If we stay silent, he controls the narrative. We don't have that luxury. As the day unfolded, Regina's team worked tirelessly to combat the smear campaign. They released evidence, testimonies, and the full footage that Greg had manipulated. But the damage was done, doubt had been planted, and some people were eager to believe the worst. By the evening, Regina found herself sitting alone in her office, the exhaustion of the day weighing heavily on her. She stared at the stacks of files on her desk, each one representing a step forward in a system that resisted change at every turn. Her phone buzzed with a call from Daniels. Chief, we've got a lead on Greg's next move, he said. He's planning to confront you directly. Publicly. Regina's stomach tightened. When? Tomorrow. At the precinct. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Then we'll be ready. The next morning, as Regina prepared for what was sure to be another battle, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. Greg was throwing everything he had at her, but she wasn't about to back down. This wasn't just about her, it was about the community, the department, and the principles she'd built her career on. When Greg arrived at the precinct later that day, he was flanked by a small group of supporters. The tension in the air was palpable as he walked into the main lobby, his gaze fixed on Regina, who stood at the far end of the room. Chief Carter, Greg said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. I think it's time we had a conversation. Regina stepped forward, her expression calm but firm. What do you want, Greg? I want the truth, he said, spreading his arms theatrically. I want everyone to see who you really are. Regina tilted her head slightly. And who am I, Greg? Enlighten us. You're a fraud, he said, his voice rising. You don't care about this department or this city. You're just here to make yourself look good. Regina's gaze didn't waver. And what about you, Greg? Are you here to protect and serve? Or are you just trying to save yourself? The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Greg's smirk faltered, his bravado slipping for a moment before he doubled down. This isn't over, he said, his voice lower but no less venomous. You've made a lot of enemies, Carter. Don't think they'll all just sit back and let you destroy what we've built. Regina stepped closer, her voice steady and unshaken. What you've built is a system that protects the wrong people and punishes those who stand up to it. And you're right, it's not over. But I'll tell you this, Greg, I'm not the one who should be worried. The room was silent as Greg stared at her, his face a mixture of anger and uncertainty. For the first time, he seemed to realize he might not come out on top. And for the first time, Regina felt the tide beginning to turn. The air in the precinct felt thick, charged with unspoken tension after Greg's confrontation. Officers moved cautiously through the corridors, their whispers echoing off the walls. Regina remained in the lobby, her composure unshaken, even as Greg and his supporters lingered nearby, their presence a clear act of defiance. Daniels approached her quietly, his expression a mixture of concern and respect. That was intense, he said under his breath. Are you okay? Regina nodded, her eyes locked on Greg, who stood leaning against the front desk, loudly recounting his grievances to anyone who would listen. I'm fine, she said evenly. But he's not done. Daniels followed her gaze. No, he's not. But we're ready. Regina glanced at him, her voice firm but low. Make sure we are. I don't want any surprises. Daniels gave a small nod and walked away, leaving Regina alone with her thoughts. She knew Greg's next move wouldn't be as public as his tantrum in the lobby. He thrived on chaos but operated best in the shadows. If he was escalating, it meant he had something planned. Later that afternoon, Regina called a meeting with her senior staff in the conference room. The atmosphere was tense as the team filed in, their faces reflecting the strain of the past few days. Daniels took his usual seat by her side, his presence a silent reassurance. Let's get straight to it, Regina began, her tone brisk. We all know what's happening. Greg Walters isn't just trying to save himself, he's trying to undermine everything we're working to fix. There were murmurs of agreement, though some officers exchanged uneasy glances. He's not alone, Regina continued. He has allies, both inside and outside this department. They're trying to spin a narrative that I'm the problem, that this department was fine before I got here. We know that's not true. Captain Harris, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. Chief, with all due respect, this is bigger than just Greg. There's a faction in this department that doesn't want change. They see you as a threat to their way of doing things. I know that, Regina said, her voice calm but steely. And that's exactly why we can't back down. If we let them win, we're telling the entire city that we're okay with the status quo. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Finally, Daniel spoke. We've got evidence, he said. Enough to make a solid case against Greg and his supporters. But it's going to get messy. They're going to fight this every step of the way. Regina nodded. Let them fight. We'll fight harder. The meeting adjourned, and as the team dispersed, Regina stayed behind, staring at the board where they'd outlined their strategy. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about Greg, it was about the future of the department and the trust of the community. Meanwhile, Greg sat in a dimly lit bar with Mitchell and Carter, his two remaining allies. The room was quiet except for the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation from the other patrons. This is getting out of hand, Carter said, his voice hushed. She's not backing down, Greg. If anything, she's gaining more support. Greg glared at him. Then we push harder. We make her look like the problem. Mitchell frowned. How? She's already exposed most of your dirt. If we go after her now, it's just going to make us look worse. Greg's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. "There's always a way," he muttered. "People like her have skeletons. We just have to find them." "And if we don't?" Carter asked. Greg's eyes darkened. "Then we make them." The words hung in the air, a dangerous promise that sent a chill through the room. The next day, Regina arrived at the precinct to find the atmosphere even tenser than before. Officers avoided eye contact, their movements quick and deliberate, as if trying to stay out of the line of fire. Daniels met her at the door, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "Another one?" Regina asked, her tone weary but sharp. Daniels handed her a file. "Greg's allies are leaking internal documents to the press. They're framing it as evidence of mismanagement under your leadership." Regina opened the file, her eyes scanning the pages. The documents were heavily redacted, their context twisted to fit Greg's narrative. She closed the file and looked up at Daniels. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. "The media's eating it up, and public opinion is starting to shift. People are questioning whether you're the right person for the job." Regina took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then we need to respond." Again. That evening, Regina held another press conference, standing before a room packed with reporters and flashing cameras. She spoke with the same calm authority that had carried her through countless battles. "The documents being circulated are taken out of context," she said firmly. "They're an attempt to distract from the real issue, the need for accountability in this department. I won't let this smear campaign derail the progress we've made." The questions came fast and furious, each one designed to undermine her credibility. Regina answered them all with poise, refusing to let the pressure crack her resolve. As the press conference ended, Regina returned to her office, exhaustion seeping into her bones. She sank into her chair, her mind racing with the events of the day. The battle against Greg was taking its toll, but she couldn't afford to stop now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniels, "Greg's making his move. Be ready." Regina stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She didn't know what Greg had planned, but she knew it would be the fight of her career. This was it, the moment that would define her leadership and the future of the department. Across town, Greg was pacing in his apartment, his mind churning with anger and desperation. He had one last card to play, and he was ready to use it. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and determined. "We end this." The precinct was unusually still that morning, as if the building itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. Regina walked through the front doors with her head high, her steps purposeful. Her team had spent the night preparing for Greg's final move, ensuring that every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every shred of truth was ready to counter whatever he might throw at them. But the weight of what was at stake hung heavy in the air. Daniels was waiting in her office, his face grim but determined. "He's here," he said simply. Regina nodded. "Let's finish this." In the conference room, Greg sat at the head of the table, his posture defiant as he waited for Regina to arrive. A small group of his remaining supporters flanked him, their expressions a mix of loyalty and unease. They knew this was a gamble, and not all of them were convinced it would pay off. Regina entered the room with Daniels by her side, her presence commanding. She placed a folder on the table in front of Greg, her gaze unwavering. "Before you say whatever it is you came here to say," Regina began, her voice steady, "I think you should take a look at this." Greg hesitated, his bravado faltering for a moment. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a comprehensive report compiled by Internal Affairs, detailing his history of misconduct, the complaints that had been buried, and the connections he had leveraged to protect himself. "This is who you are," Regina said, her tone calm but cutting. "This is what you've built your career on. Lies, intimidation, and corruption." Greg looked up at her, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "You think this will scare me?" You think this will stop me? It's not about scaring you, Regina replied. It's about holding you accountable. And you can't run from this anymore. Greg's supporters exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence they'd placed in him beginning to crumble. One of them, Carter, finally spoke up. Greg, this is bad, he said, his voice low. Maybe it's time to walk away. Greg glared at him. You're really going to turn on me now? After everything? This isn't turning on you, Carter replied. This is realizing you've dragged us into a fight we can't win. The room fell silent, the weight of Carter's words settling over them. Greg clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. But before he could respond, Regina spoke again. This isn't just about you, Greg, she said. This is about the department. The community. The people who've been hurt because you thought you were untouchable. It's over. Greg stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You think you've won? He said, his voice rising. You think you're better than me? You're just another politician, using this job to make yourself look good. Regina stepped closer, her gaze steady. This isn't about me. This is about justice. And the difference between us is that I've fought for it my whole life, while you've spent yours trying to avoid it. Greg stared at her, his chest heaving with anger. But the room was against him now. Even his most loyal supporters had turned, their silence a clear betrayal. He was alone. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Greg Walters, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Greg didn't resist as the cuffs were placed on his wrists. For the first time, he looked defeated, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. He was escorted out of the room, his departure marked by a silence that felt both heavy and liberating. As the door closed behind him, Regina turned to the remaining officers in the room. This isn't the end, she said. This is the beginning. We have a long way to go, but today we took a step in the right direction. One by one, the officers nodded, their expressions a mixture of respect and resolve. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. Later that day, Regina stood outside the precinct, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the city. Reporters gathered around her, their cameras flashing as she addressed the crowd. Today, we held one of our own accountable, she said. It's a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to uphold it. This isn't just about one person, it's about changing a culture. And we're committed to that change. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound a testament to the impact of her words. Regina felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. As the crowd dispersed, Daniels approached her, a rare smile on his face. You did good, Chief, he said. Regina smiled back. We all did. This was a team effort. That evening, as Regina returned home, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in months. The weight of the battle with Greg was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew she had the strength to face them. And Greg? He faced a trial that exposed the full extent of his misconduct, leading to a conviction that ensured he would never wear a badge again. The supporters who had rallied around him quietly distanced themselves, their loyalty fading as the truth came to light. In the end, he was left to confront the consequences of his actions alone. For Regina, it was a victory not just for herself, but for the community she had sworn to serve. And as she looked out at the city she loved, she knew this was just the beginning. Reflecting on this story, it's clear that accountability and integrity are not just ideals, they're necessities. Regina's journey reminds us that change is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for. What did you take away from this story? Did it make you think about the systems in place around us and how we can work to improve them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more narratives that challenge, inspire, and surprise. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.